welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, has music declined? And we are joined by Right Ruminations again. So, Tim, start us off with this, please.
The idea for the show has come from reading both Steven Pinker as well as Matt Ridley and then some other thinkers like Alex Epstein. And one of the ideas is are we living the best times in history? So I think there's three theories of history you could have. You know, we live in the best time ever, we live in mediocre average times, or we live in the worst time ever, or maybe even a fourth theory that the future could be better. So that's the general idea, is just sort of investigate, whether or not culture is as bad as some of the paleocons claim it is. So the paleocons, as well as interestingly many Marxists, in a roundabout fashion, sort of a convoluted fashion, oftentimes have this idea that the historical culture was much better than the current culture. With the paleocons, it's a lot easier to do. And of course, we brought in Roger Scruton here for this, where the past was great and we had some sort of fall. And now that after a certain date, all high culture is just terrible, and we live in this sort of consumer capitalist hellhole with terrible music and terrible everything. I mean, this is where we get Roger Scruton's tyranny of popular music, where all the stores are constantly playing this. It's like pollution. Interestingly, someone like Adorno, and this is where things get convoluted, oftentimes ends up having the same attitude as Roger Scruton, or vice versa. This was Adorno recently immigrating to the United States in 1941 after seeing Mickey Mouse. He said, "Every visit to the cinema leaves me, against all my vigilance, stupider and worse." Adorno was disoriented by mass culture and claimed that capitalist popular culture, jazz, cinema, pop songs, what Roger Scruton was talking about, and so on, manipulates us into living lives empty of true freedom and distorts our desires. Pop culture is not spontaneous expressions of the people, but a profit-driven industry. It robs us of our freedom and bends us to conform us to the needs for profit. So I think it's interesting that Marxists and some paleocons, on terms of culture, end up having very similar attitudes, albeit from a different starting point as well. So this is as far as the past. I think a few points need to be made before any discussion. I'm going to pass it to Right Ruminations. First of all, in the same way washing machines and steam engines probably did more to for feminism or ending slavery, I think things like radio and then YouTube and cheap recording devices have probably done more for music, for better or for worse. Everyone can listen to music almost any time. And this relates back to the Steven Pinker point that we live in the Matt Ridley point that we live in the best time. People could be walking around listening to Mozart if they wanted to all the time. Whether or not everyone does that is probably a human nature question, but it is quite clear we have expansion of technology. So I think that is a lot of the mass culture that's emerged. So Right Ruminations, do you agree with Adorno and Roger Scruton here that pop music is tyrannical? Do you think this is as bad as it says it is? Do you think there is gems of pop culture, or do you think it's as bad as they say it is?
I would like to point to the argument that Ludwig von Mises made about traditionalists, when he said that what they are really pining after, in a sense, is to return time when technology made the options less available, so the vulgarity of the lower classes didn't assert itself as readily. So if people have fewer options, and only those who have a certain degree of wherewithal, the elites, have the ability to actually influence the culture, then the culture is going to appear higher than it is. It's going to appear artificially sophisticated. What you have with capitalism is you have the rise of a kind of cultural honesty where every individual, regardless of class, is able to have their taste satisfied. There's no particular reason to think that if a medieval peasant weren't ability to construct any kind of music or to have any kind of automobile configuration, that they wouldn't be into things that we might consider vulgar, like tail fins or what have you. So this is not to say whether whether or not this assessment of relative cultural value is true or not. It's simply to say that I definitely don't the past was as artistically sophisticated by nature as we might be inclined to believe, so much as by circumstance. That being said, I agree with the general preferences of Scruton and Adorno in that I believe that there is something very disheartening, very distasteful about at least the extremes of pop culture. There are certain elements of pop culture, and I think that it's difficult to draw the line between what's good and what's bad. But what I will say is that there is something disconcerting about the mindlessness of music in a supermarket, let's say, that clearly is not there if you are going to a concert hall to listen to Beethoven. That is, there's a lack of attentiveness, there's a lack of orderliness, there's a lack of transcendence, there is a lack of almost aesthetic hygiene in the extremities of popular culture. But I would posit a different outlook ultimately, in that I think it's possible for things to be both the worst and the best that they've ever been. In that the reason that it would appear that classical culture is at an all-time low is because the official gatekeepers of classical highbrow culture are not really where highbrow culture is found. If you look at modern video games, for example, you find these vast fantasy worlds that have all of this sort of surreal depiction of these classical themes, and you have beautiful symphonic music written in a lot of movies, maybe not so much ones that are coming out now, but just in the modern era. Films have featured very great classical music, and they have a kind of artistic sophistication that technology simply wouldn't allow for in the past. What I really think is that that modernity and technology allow for all tastes to be expressed. So the most vulgar, primitive tastes get their full expression. So do the most sophisticated, highbrow tastes, which are not to be found in musical university departments. They're actually to be found in certain pockets of popular culture. That is appreciation for certain classical sensibilities with regard to beauty. I also think that this classical culture that Scruton is pointing to is itself a modern phenomenon. Music does not become very good until the Renaissance, with composers like Josquin, Palestrina, and Thomas Tallis. And the norm throughout human history for music is arguably similar to today's pop music. That is a monophony, single line music that has sort of obvious entertainment value, and is more uniform. And if you look today, I would say that the problem is not that modernity in music. The problem is that in some ways we're reverting to primitivism, and actually pop music in many ways has commonalities with earlier, less developed forms of music. So I'd say that modernity in general has done well for music in that it does correlate with the rise of classical music. Like, classical music doesn't get much better than, say, the symphonies of Vaughan Williams, of Ralph Vaughan Williams. And so the modernity does have this sort of teleological implication for music where it does get better and better, but I view the degradation of music in pop culture as emblematic of primitivism reasserting itself against this modern classical Western culture. And so I think that in music, this polarity, this polarization between these beautiful vistas and symphonic settings that you have in, say, fantasy video games on the one hand, and then this sort of drab vulgarity you have in the supermarket, on the other hand, is really emblematic of this tension between the advancement of classical, modern, advanced themes on the one hand, and then the call of the jungle back to primitivism on the other hand.
I think it's quite difficult to say whether music has in fact declined or got better. I do think pop music is a more commercialized form of effectively folk music, and I think Scruton recognizes that, although he just makes some distinctions. And I think one of the reasons why we don't think about the past of having this more quote-unquote lowbrow music is because it doesn't really... We have no records of it because it was oral, it wasn't really written down, it was played in taverns and various different places, and so... you don't really have a great amount of records of that. Although, interestingly, I mean, there's been lots of sort of higher brow music which has been influenced by folk. I'm pretty sure some of the tunes used by Martin Luther were bar tunes. And also Dvorak in the New World Symphony uses lots of folk music ideas from the US into his symphony. So there's been sort of crossover more historically, but the fact that pop music is a form of folk music, I think, is rather obvious. Scruton, with his view on pop music, he does make the point you'd make about the way in which music is experienced. It's sort of overheard now in sort of odd places like the supermarket, etc., which is, I think, an interesting point. But Scruton himself seems to object to electronic music, which seems... He doesn't really seem to have any arguments to why it's necessarily bad. But he kind of objects to it. It turns music from a human endeavor into a sort of mechanical endeavor. And he links this sort of like high levels of music production in pop and sort of rock music. And how the pop music today that's produced can't be sort of played by anybody in the way that traditional folk music was. He sees it as personalities who were taking over from the music. I can see that to some extent, although I think that's largely just good marketing and a way of distinguishing yourself. And if someone has a different form of music that no one else can replicate, is that particularly bad and mean that there isn't music there? I don't really think so. From what I've read of his Scruton, he seems to say that pop music kind of declined, I think, from the 60s onwards, as I say, with the introduction of electronic stuff. I think with mainstream sort of like chart music, I've written a number of quizzes in the past, and I looked at UK number ones, and there does seem to be a marked decline in quality from about 2008, 9, maybe a bit later, 2011, when the chart music just becomes really bad dance and hip hop music, which very much moves away from melody and is much more focused on rhythm, more so than melody as the earlier pop music was. So you could say I'm holding a similar view to Scruton, although about 50 years different in time. But what is clear with the advent of the internet and cheaper recording is that really chart music doesn't really matter in the same way as it did, say, in the 1970s. There's much more variety of sort of popular music, as it were, although no one song is as popular as the popular music used to be, because you've got a more diversified market. So it's difficult to say even if pop music, as it were, has declined, just because there's so much more of it and there's so much variety which you previously didn't get. So that's that. I forgot what I was going to say next. Tim, have you got any thoughts on anything that's been discussed so far?
Yes. So I want to quote Scruton here because I think he says something quite interesting regarding this. This is where from his piece on the cultural significance of pop. Recent criticism. This is what Scruton says, I avoided any discussion of pop lyrics since I wish to focus on the sound of pop and to its effect on the ear, attention, and movement of those who overhear it. Recent criticism has paid much attention to the words. There's often dwell on drugs, sex, violence, rebellion, and so forth. But this is what I find what Scruton says interesting regarding pop music. But these criticisms do not, I think, get to the heart of the matter. Even if every pop song consisted of a setting of Christ's Beatitudes, and of course there are born again groups in America that have this, it would make little difference to the effect which communicating through the sound, regardless of what is sung to them. So I think we should differentiate between the words of pop music and the structure of the music itself. So Scruton seems to think that the structure of the music itself is kind of primitive, which goes back to the point that Right Ruminations made. But this is where I have some problems with sort of some paleocon's perception of the past at times, as well as Marxist in a way. Is as you made the peasant in 15th century Russia, he's probably not going to be not that Beethoven was around that way, but he's probably not producing complex music of any variety. And I think a further interesting point has to be made since English history is in more broadly Protestant history is Protestants have a sort of anti-musical theological tilt to them. It's worth pointing out that many Protestant churches don't have instruments and still do. This was very common in the Puritan times. For example, this is an article from describing very much opposed the use of church organs. The Roundheads had gone through England, destroying the noble organs in the churches and cathedrals, only 4 or 5 of them being left uninjured. The prejudice was transferred to New England. Cotton Mather and other preachers attacked the use of musical instruments in churches. And of course, you have the 1642 ban on Shakespeare as well. So as far as the production of high culture, it seems like it almost exclusively comes out of these sort of elitist Catholic monarchies. I mean, that's all the patrons of Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn. They were all patronized by princes and papals of the Roman Catholic Church. So since this is a sort of Protestant country here in the United States and Britain, there's that. So as far as the structure is concerned, do you think Scruton's difference is relevant? If you just take the words of the music, and you just take the structure of the music, he seems to think it's quite bad. Do the two of you agree or disagree? I'll pass it to Right Ruminations first.
Well, I think that the point is correct that we don't really have an accurate recording of what the past was like, and often we have misleading ideas of what it was like aesthetically. If you look at, say, the cover of the Oxford edition of Plato's Republic, it will have a picture of the Athenian Acropolis that looks like something out of a modern fantasy film. It is the kind of a reconstruction of what's left of the Acropolis. All of the paint is gone. It looks like this sort of very elegant, reconstructed ruin, as it were. It's all brown stone, and it has this kind of lofty, classical look about it. But it's agreed that the Acropolis was actually painted in these garish colors that were meant to sort of dazzle the eye. And one can imagine that if one had to be in the company of the regular sort of people that inhabited that city and was every day beset by the garish and startling colors of the Acropolis, then maybe one would not be so taken with it, or would not think that it had such a value as this lofty antique construction. And I think that this probably, at risk of some exaggeration, has relevance for the reality of the past more generally. And what we think of as classical culture, I'll emphasize again, really is something that comes out of the Renaissance, and it seems to me to still be developing today in certain pockets of cultural development. There's also something else that was brought up about what Scruton had said about pop music being distracting, as being a sort of something that you don't sit down to. But the problem is that I think that Scruton is missing the whole picture, because there are certain instances where that can really work well. Like if you're sitting down in a bar, for example, and there's like a faint Billy Joel song playing in the background or something, then there's a sense of a story being told there. There's still that sense of drama or of harmonic tension or something. There's still this sort of aesthetic subtlety about that. And likewise, even with techno music, there's a sort of cheeky type of libertarian music that's, I think, produced by Chase Rachels called Hoppe Wave, where it's these sort of techno beats with speeches by Hans Hermann Hoppe played over top of it, with him making these sort of right libertarian speeches. And if there's this sort of cyberpunk element in that, if you imagine that being played in some sort of futuristic nightclub or something, that there's real drama there. And so, just like the way in movies or video games, classical music can be a background. In fact, if I were to go to the supermarket and to hear classical music played in the background, I wouldn't complain about it because it's distracting or because I don't have to sit down. I would approve of it because it sounds good. And I think the problem is that Scruton, by making this distinction between entertainment and concert or programmatic music, is trying to evade the real difficult question, which is simply, why is some music so bad and some music so good? I don't really think the fact that it's played in the background makes it worse, because there's plenty of good types of music or good scenarios where I do want music played in the background. So I really think that the problem with this music is that it is this pop music is that it is shouty. It is it represents, it embodies certain platonic qualities that are just emotionally inferior. That is, it is intentionally trying to convey a sense of low-mindedness, a sense of just distraction, a sense of sort of animalistic urgency, and it really is tailored to convey a certain sense of obnoxiousness, which I think people like. And you might say, well, that's awfully subjective, RR, but then again, so is any emotional quality. And I think this is what Scruton is trying to avoid. He's trying to avoid painting himself into a corner where he has to justify the subjective preference for some kind of emotional aesthetic quality over others. And since he realizes that's difficult, he tries to sort of bypass it by making this distinction between like silent or concert music and music that's distractive. Whereas I think that unfortunately, the real distinction is much more ethereal and much more difficult to quantify. But I think it's necessary to be honest about that.
I do think Scruton does try in other places to say that some music is better or worse than others, although it does admit approaching a more sort of, as it were, objective aesthetic theory is not straightforward, to say the least. But I do agree with you. His point about being overheard and sort of sat down and listened to is overstated, because it doesn't follow from the fact that you overhear music that you cannot sit and listen to it. And I don't see why you couldn't have both. And as you point out, there are certain circumstances in which music in the background, as it were, seems fitting. I mean, Scruton is, unlike Adorno, favourable to jazz, and lots of jazz in jazz bars is bars in the back, people are talking, or it's not something that is just sat down to and listened to. Now, I suppose Scruton probably thinks that's the best type of music. when you read him, he seems very much like he's a man out of time. He feels like he should be in the late 19th century. And all the music should be constant. The best music is constant music you sit down, you listen to, and you're given your full attention all the time, which I think is a very good thing to do. I just don't think you need to do it all the time. And I think one of the reasons why people did do it in the 19th century and earlier is there was no other real way of hearing it, unless you were playing it yourself. He does make an interesting point in another place about music appreciation, in which he says one way to get the general public to be more discerning with music is actually get them to play a musical instrument of certain description, because this will be they will understand music better by playing it. And he also mentions that the teacher of this can get his students to play music he likes, the students like, sorry, and then play music he likes, and then sort of show the differences. I think that's a good thing to do, and that shows well in musical education. But with with lowbrow so popular music, you mentioned Chase Rachel's with his Hopperwave stuff. You also have kind of the sort of fash wave / synth wave music of, say, the last sort of 5-10 years or so, Exurious, etc., which is, seems perfectly reasonable music. It's not always brilliant, but it is significantly more tuneful than much dance music. And, in a bar or whatever could be perfectly reasonable to play, despite it being basically entirely electronic. I think there's artistic ways of using electronic stuff which Scruton doesn't seem to focus on. With respect to sort of classical culture in today, being in sort of film and video games, I think that's largely true. The Academy with classical music is generally awful and has been in serious decline since probably the First World War, maybe a little bit later. There seems to be a big crisis in sort of highbrow classical music somewhere probably in the 50s onwards. And that traditions coming out of the late Romantic period, early 20th, does go into film. Although what I would say, though, with respect to fantasy and film soundtracks, you don't get the same development and sophistication that you do with, say, the stuff pre-First World War. You'll have good tunes that will be developed, and it will be kind of it points towards an ideal, it's uplifting in certain respects. But you don't get the same development of musical ideas that you would say in a classic symphony, or even something like, let's say, example, Finlandia by Sibelius, or Vlast, I think that's correct, by Smetana. I don't think you get quite that range. I mean, if you look at the track lengths, let's take example of Skyrim is interesting. I don't think there's any tracks over 3 minutes. Having listened to the playlist via YouTube, and also actually if you link like Lord of the Rings soundtrack, again there may be a 5-minute track, but it doesn't do anything more than that. And I think that time just didn't really give you the space in which to develop as sophisticated musical ideas as you say get. I don't know, let's say Tchaikovsky in 1812 Overture. Tim, any additional thoughts?
So I think a quick comment on teleology is comparing the past and the present needs to be made, and this is where I think Adorno and Scruton things get tricky. As far as the whatever the structure or the words, I think one point needs to be made. And from whatever group you talk about, from the Beatles to the Motorhead, Metallica, punk rock, whatever, their aesthetic to a certain extent is loud and shouty. Although interestingly, if you hear I think the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra has put on some instrumental versions of pop songs, and some Beatles pop music to me instrumentalized with Scruton's natural quote unquote instruments um, sounds quite good. Now, as far as the natural instruments is concerned, I sort of have a technical dispute here. In some ways, a piano is not really natural. It's sort of like a continuum problem where, the one side you have stone tools, the other side you have a Boeing 747. What's natural and what isn't? So I don't really see ooh yuck computer. In some ways, I think that to a certain extent is a faux distinction. But some of the pop groups' aesthetic is sort of this sort of godless, angry, young, angry type view, which I think if peasants and of the ancien regime had music, they might have played this. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. If you read someone like Richard Pipes, it seems like the Eastern Orthodox believed in 10 different religions, and almost no one actually knew anything about Christ's Gospels. There's a one line in Richard, and only the old believers knew actually anything of the Gospels. So I think if you read, if you actually could listen, go back in time as an anthropologist, you might get a strange view of English peasants or Russian peasants at the time. Although, of course, you could get the Puritans who by definition say, well, and Tertullian and some of these other Puritan Protestants, because the early church may not have, are just as much as but anti-culture in a very sophisticated sense, which whether or not Scruton is part of that tradition is some question. But so the aesthetics of a lot of pop music is somewhat purposely terrible. Whether or not hip hop fits into that category is of some question. But I do agree that movies like Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns, I think the soundtracks behind them are outstanding, and are worth a quiet listen. I say this as a person who's played music in a band in high school, an orchestra in high school. We played classical music and we played some of his stuff, and I thought it was outstanding. And I think Hans Zimmer's soundtracks are also outstanding. Now, do they compare to Mozart, Haydn? I don't know. We're presenting a more apples to apples comparison, not a 3-minute pop song versus an hour-long piece. But I think the quality starts approaching. And if you combine that with the movie itself, the medium, maybe you can get an actual rough apples to apples comparison. But I do think different times have different teleologies in that sense. So, Right Ruminations or Swithin, any comments on that?
Well, I will say a word about Scruton's nostalgia. That he does tend to be sort of an anachronistic or limited in scope, in that a lot of his critiques do seem based on sort of things not being as they were in the past. I think Swithin had mentioned that he almost seems like he's speaking as though he were someone from the late 19th century. This is a problem with paleo-conservatives in general, in terms of their outlook on what's legitimate and what's not. It really does seem like they don't come out and say this, but they sort of create an image of how things were in the past and then critique the present on the basis of it not being that. This is something that may very well be present in Plato himself. If you look at him complaining that music is, if it's danced to and it's played in the Mixolydian mode, it leads to degeneracy. But if it's in Dorian and it's serious and people listen to it, then it's somehow desirable. And that really does seem that he's describing it almost in the way a paleo-conservative would be. Remember back when I was a child and all the music in Athens was in Dorian. But the problem is that by the time you get to say the 21st century, the meter shifts And you get to the point where, on the basis of that same attitude, you're defending jazz because it's not rap or hip hop, right? So it doesn't really speak to anything universal. It's just sort of, well, it's not what I'm familiar with. So I kind of think that's also responsible for the lack of appreciation in classical music in pop culture, because it is sort of this comparison with the past as opposed to trying to glean a kind of universal quality as to which aspects of music are desirable and which are less desirable. So I think that if you're just looking for what's proper, then the goalpost is always going to be shifting, and it's just going to come across as being kind of nostalgic and uncomfortable with the modern world. But if you do try to look for this universal appeal of beauty, of transcendence, then there's a much firmer footing in that, even if it's more difficult to quantify. Also, a word about the comparison between classical music in pop culture and classical music in the past. I take Swithin's point that Skyrim's soundtrack, for example, is not as sophisticated as, say, the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Even though I'd probably be honest in saying I probably prefer the aesthetic of the Skyrim soundtrack to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, as Beethoven is not my favorite composer. But in any event, I take the point. But I would also say that if you look at this Skyrim soundtrack, you have to look at the context, look at the game that it's attached to. Internalize the fact that it's merely the accompaniment to this virtual in-world reality, and you think, well, if that's just what the sort of afterthought of the soundtrack is like, well, what could you do with that kind of energy? What kind of classical development musically could you then? What sort of opportunity is implicit in simply having soundtracks that sound like that, if it were to be taken in a more explicitly musical development? I also think that the Lord of the Rings and the Skyrim as examples may not even be qualitatively the best examples. If you look at, say, John Williams' Star Wars prequels soundtracks, I think that those are arguably better. And while they are romantic and not really program music, as it were, that is, they are meant to evoke certain emotions or tell a story. I mean, they do that with every bit as much depth and sophistication as Wagner or Vaughan Williams. That is, they reach new emotional depths. They do original emotional work and explore worlds theretofore unexplored. So I agree that because of circumstances there is a problem in technical sophistication. I think that there have been improvements as well, but I think that the reason that the paleoconservative mentality, to get back to what I was saying a moment ago, is falls short, is because it is implicitly based on nostalgia as opposed to based on the quest for universal aesthetic values. Pardon me if I answered a different question accidentally.
I agree with you with respect to sort of Skyrim and sort of Lord of the Rings, and also actually John Williams. I think his prequel soundtracks are actually very good and significantly better than the films to a large extent, although you could argue the same for the original trilogy. And it is certainly the case that sort of more classically inspired music has gone in video games, etc., and film. And yeah, I agree. I mean, if you had the composers who were focusing just on music as a separate sort of classical suite or whatever, then yeah, you could get some absolutely tremendous music. It's just we don't get it from the colleges and the university departments. So I certainly think that's the case. And as Tim points out, the film soundtracks are are good music in their own right, and they provide they take you on a sort of have good emotional sort of resonance to it. One sort of relatively short piece, but a very good one. Ennio Morricone's what's it called? Gabriel Zobo from The Mission. That's obviously there to tell a story as part of it, but is clearly a good piece of music. With classical music as such, I mean, there is some more sort of serious classical stuff which is actually pretty good. I mean, from my understandings of contemporary sort of classical music, they've been very much influenced by medieval music. They've also kind of gone to pre-Renaissance, which is interesting. Your view that sort of classical culture comes from the Renaissance period, and I think it from some of the stuff I've listened, it's slightly more slightly more modal, I think, in certain respects. So it's kind of goes to sort of an earlier sort of musical style. One piece I'm thinking in particular, one of the songs, Lacrimosa from Terrence Malick's Tree of Life, it was like a modern sort of classical piece by a guy I can barely pronounce. I think he's Polish, Zbigniew Przesna, with a modern version of a requiem, and it has sort of some medieval sort of style influences, and also jazz. Interestingly, jazz is interesting. It's sort of become acceptable in high culture, whereas where it came onto the scene, it was very vulgar and lowbrow. Although I would be interested to see what Scruton and others would have of sort of the more contemporary free jazz. I don't know if they would take too kindly to that, because it's distinctly, well, it isn't obviously melodic in certain respects. So I think that's all I've got for the moment. Tim?
So moving on here, hierarchy. One of the points that I think, and this is where the Randians end up being the most objective in some strange way. The Randians would argue that there is a cultural hierarchy, that certain music is better than others. This is where I think, again, I think Adorno and Scruton, I would end up agreeing with them, in the contrary to the professors that Scruton's criticizing, that let's study pop culture the same way we study classical culture. I mean, I think there's just some pop culture clearly doesn't have that much internal significance or complexity, so it's not a particularly good medium to study. It's sort of like looking at a mousetrap and trying to find out, what to find the or they'll do silly stuff like look for the racism in Richard Wagner, or that kind of historical study is just totally absurd to me. Which sort of reminds me of the Puritans of old day, who banned there. So as far as ranking, if you want to construct a ranking, do you think classical cultures, broadly speaking, would go on top of the pyramid? Do you think an importance should be placed on this? I think this is where it seems like Scruton and Adorno are both from opposite directions. Although if you look at Scruton's early life, and Peter Hitchens for that matter holds similar views. He was a Trotskyist as well. Things get to a certain extent complicated there. Whether they actually did start at opposite directions is some question. But nonetheless, is there a rank? Would someone like Richard Wagner or Haydn or whoever should they go on the top of the pyramid, and should someone like the jazz, the pop, and the hip hop go at the bottom of the pyramid, or is this kind of ranking of preferences, which I think it's either done through the market, where people just go out and buy. Although this is what's interesting about modernity is, if you look at YouTube views of classical music, it's fairly well viewed. It's not zero. It may not be as much as some of the boogeymans of pop culture, but it's not zero either. And considering their length, now we don't know how long people listen to them in what context, but still, it's not zero. So is there a? I would tend to argue there is, although I think there's different domains. We have a domain problem, and there's some music today. You get the phenomenon of weaponized classical music. I'm not really sure if we want to play. I'm not really sure if we want to play classical music at Walmart or Aldi's or Tesco. This is where things get complicated for me. Where maybe keeping the classical music out of the supermarket might actually be a good idea. And maybe even the Marcus and Adorno would agree. So Right Ruminations, do you think there is a hierarchy, or are you going to say, oh, all music is the same? I'm not saying you probably would say that, but it seems like there are preferences that exist and tastes.
I definitely think that there is a hierarchy, and I think that classical music of some kind would definitely be at the top, precisely because it represents the greatest cultivation, sophistication. It is the most truly art in terms of trying to embody these transcendental qualities, and also of trying to negotiate the tension between freedom and arbitrary restrictions. I definitely would not place jazz second, and I'll just take a moment to point out my distaste for modern classical aficionados who, after they're done upholding the virtues of classical music and talking about bemoaning the loss of appreciation for classical music, then are very quick to point out that they do like jazz because they want to show their appreciation for ethnic music, and they want to show that they're not all that they are able to have a good time and be cool, even though they're clearly of the elite. And I think also a part of it might be a guilty pleasure aspect. I think that maybe they just need to find something that is more like informal to listen to. So they probably actually like listening to the jazz better, or they find it easier to consume, but they need to find something that sort of is elite, but also is not quite as challenging to their palates as having to only listen to classical all day. So I would say that after classical, it's anyone's guess what comes next. I think that the division into classical and non-classical music is a fairly obvious one. I would not want classical music necessarily played at the supermarket. That would seem rather desperate, and also would serve to kind of weaponize, as you say, classical music in a way that would be sort of propagandistic and vulgar. Maybe something as comical as this sounds, I wouldn't mind hearing something like some sort of techno wave music being played at the supermarket, although I'm not holding my breath for that. Maybe in certain public spaces, perhaps in the subway, they should have some sort of or in some scenario, I'm not sure what, but in some public spaces, they should have some sort of choral opera being played to give it this feeling of sort of ominous grandeur. But no, I definitely don't want Mozart to be blaring at the supermarket. That would seem that would definitely give off the vibe of trying too hard.
Maybe they could play classical music in the courthouse. That might be an interesting venue to play that prior to the judge's entrance. Might be somewhat appropriate. When it comes to hierarchy, I agree there is a hierarchy. I mean, the technical sophistication and richness that you get in quote-unquote classical music is greater than you get anywhere else. Now, it does require more time and effort to listen to, but I think on a purely aesthetic level, I think it is clearly the highest. Although you could say that's somewhat by definition. I suppose the way in which we would define classical music is by kind of, to some extent, its sophistication. Although that's not always true. I mean, you do have relatively short works by composers which are reasonably sophisticated, but they're not a symphony. There's a violin quartet by Vivaldi, which is played in Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, which is a very good piece, but I mean, it's not pop, but it's not the most classical of classical if you use the symphony as sort of the gold standard, as it were, of classical music. Although on classical music, I'm not particularly fond of the classical period proper. I do think there are things to be said about Baroque and Romanticism over classicism, and I've never been a huge fan of Mozart. I don't understand why he's so popular. Even my brother agrees, who has a music degree. We were discussing this recently because there was an article about why Beethoven was so popular from the Imaginative Conservative, which I read recently. After classical, I think it's difficult to say. Jazz, I think, is fine in certain doses, although I think you get to a problem where it becomes less melodic and you get an issue there. I do think some forms of rock are actually quite sophisticated and quite interesting. Certain aspects of progressive rock are pretty good. But I think it's difficult to say by genre, particularly because there's so much diversity within it. But I would generally make the claim that the more, not just sophisticated, I'm tempted to say more sophistication is better. But then you could claim that certain, oh no, would you really claim that serialism was sophisticated? Well, it's very difficult to play. But is very bad. But that would be a general view. But again, though, I wouldn't want to denigrate the value of good sort of folk music in the most general sense. And there's a time and place for it. So I think you can, in the same way that you don't want to be eating Michelin star food every day, and the burger bar is fine. In the same way, I don't think we need to have classical music overall and played everywhere. There's a time and place it would be out of place to be played everywhere. Tim, any thoughts?
As far as the dislike of Mozart, that's very clear. Rand famously had this with Mozart Was a Red. The play Mozart Was a Red, Murray Rothbard's play regarding that. As far as weaponizing classical music, this is it's an article from describing in January it was revealed that West Park School in Derby in the Midlands of England was subjecting badly behaved children to Mozart. So they'd sit in detention for 2 hours as both a relaxant and as a deterrent against future bad behavior. This is where I think people like Scruton should be, to a certain extent, careful what they wish for. We could get classical music everywhere. We get it in this way of it might actually end up being more tyrannical than the vulgar pop music that is played today. And I'm going to go back to stressing the domain point. I think there is a hierarchy in music, but I think there's also a domain problem. There's a certain, and that does sound like a pure materialist, which I'm not necessarily. There's just different material circumstances to a certain extent, which explain not all. I'm not saying it explains everything, but do explain some degree of things. I mean, if Beethoven had a soundboard What would he do today? It's not entirely clear. And I do think market preferences, to a certain extent, drive it. And as Right Ruminations made before, we've certainly liberalized. We actually have evidence now. We have more recorded history of the peasants. In this sense, the peasants are the masses. And this is the culture that people like Adorno and Scruton, to a certain extent, dislike. As far as the hierarchy myself, I myself, even though I asked the question, I would find it difficult to rank it in any clear way. And probably over time, if you asked me at different times, and I wasn't trying to be purposely consistent at times, would come up with different rankings. But any comments, Right Ruminations, other than that on classical music in general and compared to modern music? We're almost approaching an hour here. Any final comments or statements regarding music and its alleged decline, or to go back to my first question, or do you think it's you said we're living the best times and the worst times? That's somewhat like a yes and no answer, which I think might be the case. Right, Ruminations?
Well, I think that this was a very interesting and conversation. I think that it really is the case that clearly the most obvious artifacts of modernity in terms of their average are not as culturally elegant as at least the way that we perceive the past. So I would say that ultimately there is cause for complaint, but the gems lie in the opportunities. So it's not even that I look at John Williams or Hans Zimmer and think that it's as good as things in the past, but I see their opportunities or hidden beginnings where it could lead to something interesting and perhaps something better. I think that it's impossible to know what direction our culture is really going in until it's already become history. So if you go back to the 18th century, the idea that it would have thought of itself as becoming renowned for the kind of music that was being written by the figures who are today the most famous artifacts from that era would be to anachronistically attribute our perspective to the perspective of the past. Likewise, I think that in the future, people will understand today what's going on much better than we do. And it may very well be the case that things like rap or even the Beatles or some more classic pop music may very well fall by the wayside in terms of the way people in 100 years look at us now, and John Williams or Hans Zimmer or Jeremy Soule may very well end up becoming the treasures of today's culture, in which case I would be very happy to hear that report. With respect to the classical era, I agree with Swithin that it's not the classical era proper is not really the best that the classical music has to offer. Though I will say that the exception for Mozart is Mozart's Requiem. Depending on the version that you listen to, there is a version of that, the name of which is slipping my mind, but that is very good. And so there is that redeeming aspect. But I do agree that Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn, in general, there is a certain degree of imposed, if not formality, then maybe appropriateness or something that detracts, it would seem, from the authenticity. But overall, I think if I were to extract a definitive theme for this conversation, it would be that paleo-conservatives, in a sense going back to Plato, are too reliant on nostalgia and ultimately not reliant enough on a universal perception of the transcendent qualities of excellence, order, beauty, and so forth. And I think that Scruton is not free from making this mistake. And so for that reason, I'm able to afford myself more optimism than perhaps they are.
On Mozart, I agree. Mozart's Requiem, I think, is by far his best overall work. But one thing I missed off with the musical hierarchy, I think we should put Hopper Wave as somewhere near the top, just for its annoyance that it causes to everybody else. Thank you for your time, R. This has been an interesting conversation, and I very much enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed this podcast and you would, if you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we go up in the rankings, and the more people can listen to it. And if you'd like to contact us with ideas about the show or topics we should cover, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.